Right, so welcome everybody. There will be some more people joining, so I hope that's not going to distract too much. Just want to thank Nash for holding this meeting. Nash Billimoria has been in our network since, we reckon it's at least 10 years, don't we, Nash? 10 years. And back 10 years. It's 10 years. So back in the day, we used to have what we used to call immersion workshops, where we used to immerse people in blueprints thinking. And Nash was one of the people that came along. We had about 3 or 4, and Nash was one of the people that came along to one of the early ones. And Nash has been working with founders and leaders of SMEs to help them to build organizations with a healthy performance culture, and he's a lot of his work has been influenced, I hope, by Blueprint. Lachlan Hickey, who was one of our founders, was one of the people that were on the immersion workshop, and I think Nash and Lachlan hit it off, didn't you? And since then had many conversations, and I know that Nash has been helping us with our thinking, and we've been helping him with his thinking. So it'll be really interesting, I think, for everyone to see how that's been turned into something practical. So Nash is going to talk a little bit about his work, give some examples of how he's drawn on our thinking and other thinking as well, the work that he does to build organizational health, and give some sort of examples and case studies. But the purpose of this is to engender some discussion. So there will be some space for you to break out and have a chat about the stuff that Nash has been sharing, and come back and share that. But as we go along, if you've got questions that you're burning to ask, can you put them in the chat, and we will have a bit at the end and in the middle that we can answer those questions. But I don't want you to forget them, and it'd be nice to sort of see what's coming up for you as we go through. So feel free to stick stuff in the chat. But I'm now going to hand over to Nash to lead us through the session. Nash, over to you.
Hello, everyone. And genuinely, sincerely, thank you so much for taking the time out, for being here, being present. I know attention is a scarce resource nowadays. I really find it so excellent and inspiring that people who don't necessarily know each other, don't interact day to day, can gather together, maybe from different places in the world. We all obviously share a common passion and interest around purpose in business. So it's really, really cool to be here. As Sula said, my relationship with Blueprint went all the way back to 2012. I just left an investment banking career, and I was trying to pivot into a new space, working with entrepreneurs. I'd been inspired by Yvon Chouinard's book, Let My People Go Surfing, which is Yvon Chouinard is the founder of Patagonia. And I started to really question, what was the role of business in society, and what could a joyful, purposeful business look like, and what could that mean, and what value could that bring to the world? And as I was having these thoughts, as I just quit my job at the time I was at Royal Bank of Scotland, I stumbled across through LinkedIn the Blueprint. I threw myself into the immersion workshop. I spent 4 days at the I think it was at the Cambridge campus, and I remember the first night, many glasses of wine, sitting next to Lachlan, and just having a riveting conversation with the team at Blueprint. And really, genuinely, I left those 4 days kind of mentally fried, with way more questions than I came in. And poor soul Lachlan, who sadly is no longer with us, he kind of agreed to take on my questions. And so we began a relationship over Zoom. And Lachlan basically co-founded Remap with me, and has been a huge mentor of mine and supporter throughout all these years until last year when he passed away. So I'm sure you'll see some of the Blueprint thinking coming through. At least I hope you do. So in short, Remap is a company that I founded, and within that, we developed a method which is called high impact culture. And the aim of high impact culture is essentially to build joyful, socially valuable, and profitable companies. And we focus on organizational health to do that. I work particularly with founders and CEOs of leadership teams, mostly of tech companies, some SMEs, based out here in Barcelona, but clients are in different parts of the world. So before I jump into more on the topic, I wanted to kick off. Oh, I should share my screen. I wanted to kick off with a question. Just bear with me a moment whilst I set up the screen share. And hopefully you can give me a thumbs up to tell me that you can see everything clearly. Hold on 1 second. Ooh. Okay, are you able to see my screen? Great. So the title I came up with for today was How Organizational Health Fuels Impact Revenue and Wellbeing. And before jumping into it, I thought we'd start off with a discussion, a question that I wanted to launch to the group. And the question is, and feel free to share just, using your words or using the chat, whatever you prefer. In your opinion, in your experience, what makes a workplace feel healthy? I wonder what your thoughts are. What do you think makes for a healthy workplace? What's your thought? What's your experience in that? Invite you to share your thoughts, either spoken or in the chat. Yeah, I see balance and trust, psychological safety, people feeling fulfilled, realizing their full potential. Yeah, I love that. It's beautiful. Environment, I lost that one. Environment, leadership, cultural norms and processes, inclusion, safety, good culture, communication, honest communication, mutual respect, inclusive again, fulfillment. I'm sure all of us, who've had experience in the workplace, either within our own companies or companies where we've worked, have had experiences of both healthy and unhealthy environments. One of the things that strikes me, I don't know what you guys think, is that often we might think of health as being the absence of dysfunction. It's like if an environment is not dysfunctional, we say that it's healthy. But as I was reflecting on that for myself, I thought, if you think about it on the level of the human body, you're not just healthy when you are not ill. I believe you're healthy when there's a certain vibrancy and a certain aliveness about yourself. And I think the same is true for organizations. And as you said in your comments, you talked about inclusiveness, about trust, about teams, about respect, about developing yourself, purpose, values, leadership. So it's obviously more than just the absence of dysfunction, isn't it? It's the presence of certain ingredients. So that's really wonderful to see that all of you have been able to pinpoint that. With your permission, I'm going to just share a little bit about my experiences around what is organizational health, what is it not, so what are the boundaries, and what are the stages of developing and cultivating organizational health. And again, just share some experiences, maybe a little bit of case study, my own personal reflections on that. And then before I jump into any form of solutions, I thought we would have a discussion a bit later on in breakouts about what have been your observations, what have you seen working when it comes to cultivating healthy environments, what have you seen not working. And then I could share a little bit about the method that we built, the success or otherwise that we've had, learnings we've had. And then we can have Q&A at the end. So that's basically the structure. Yeah, as Sulu said, if you have any questions, anything you want to comment, raise your hand, jump in, pop it in the chat, and hopefully we'll pick up on that. All right. So I thought I would just start off by juxtaposing, if that's a word, two concepts. The first is organizational intelligence. Now, I think we could summarize organizational intelligence in just 4 core themes. And those core themes are a knowledge of your market, your industry, your sector, your customer. That's the outside world. A knowledge of your value proposition, your products, services, and technology, if you have that. Your go-to-market strategy, how you market, how you sell, and then your financial strategy. And these are elements that most founders and most people that I interact with are quite expert in. And if they're not expert in, there's loads and loads of help in the area of organizational intelligence. There's no shortage of consultants, of advisors, mentors, etc., who specialize in these areas, accelerators as well. And in contrast to organizational intelligence, I think the other, let's say 50% of the equation of what makes for a company successful, being successful, is organizational health. So a simple analogy that I think really encapsulates this for me is if you think about, imagine a Formula One track, a race, a Formula One race. There's three components. There's the track and the environmental conditions. I think that represents the outside world, the environment in which we operate, the business environment, the industry, the market. Then you have the vehicle itself, which is about the business. That's the organizational intelligence. It's how well designed is that business to operate in those conditions. That's the vehicle. And then, of course, you need a driver. And the driver is what represents organizational health. And it's all about how well the business is being run. At McKinsey, they say organizational health is how leaders run the place. And so I think that analogy kind of encapsulates what that is and what the difference is. I'm sure you'll have all experienced both a healthy and an unhealthy meeting before. What are some of the hallmarks of a healthy meeting? Well, let's start off with a clarity of knowing why we've gathered together. And not only a clarity of why we've gathered together and understanding what we want to get out of a given meeting, but also a sense of personal connection to that people actually in the room actually want to be there because they see the value of whatever it is that we're discussing. And then there's the participation. You know, maybe you've been in a meeting where one person or two people are dominating the conversation. Well, in a healthy meeting, there tends to be an equal or roughly equal distribution of participation. Another thing that's a hallmark of a healthy meeting that I've observed, I wonder if you have too, is the quality and the depth of the listening. A lot of times there's listening going on, but at the same time as people are listening, they're actually preparing their next thoughts as to what are they going to respond to the person who's currently speaking. So if we're thinking about what we're going to respond and trying to listen at the same time, then the level of listening is more superficial. You could call that listening to respond as opposed to listening to understand. So in a healthy meeting, you might have experienced a deeper level of listening where people are really, really curious as to what somebody else is expressing. And there's a certain kind of stepping outside of one's own reality that takes place, where we're not trying to defend a position, but that there's this curiosity to understand what's going on for the others and using that as data to then be able to respond in a way that's measured and that provides a different perspective. I like to describe the environment of a healthy meeting as one that's both intense and relaxed at the same time. There's a certain intensity of focus. There's a certain, it's like you're watching a really good movie. It's like you're really enjoying the movie. There's a certain intensity, but at the same time, you're kind of relaxed in the same breath. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think of it as both intensity and relaxation happening at the same time. I use that as just a simple way to describe one aspect of what organizational health is, or what it feels like. And I think that hopefully you can all relate to that through your own experiences of having been in both dysfunctional meetings and hopefully some healthy ones too. So what I was going to share next is a little bit more of a, let's say, assessment of the different dimensions of organizational health. And I like to think of it in terms of three different areas. The first is purpose, second is the quality of the leadership, and the third is around execution. So I want you to think of these as like different components of what makes up, or what could make up, a healthy organization. So within purpose, you could break that down further and say, three things really come to my mind. One is the centrality of purpose, how clear it is, how well defined it is, and how much people really understand it. The second is how well that's then translated operationally through the vision, the strategy, the goals, and the accountabilities that people are working on. A lot of times you might see a well-defined purpose, but you may not see that people have a connection between the work that they do and their understanding of the goals of the organization and the strategy of the organization. They may not be able to connect those back to the purpose. So I think when purpose is present as it should, there's a clarity of what it is, why we exist as an organization, and how that exists serves to make the world a better place, to coin Alex Edmonds' definition, which I love very much. And then a translation of that purpose through those different operational elements around vision, strategy, goals, and even down to the individual roles and accountabilities that people have. And then there's also this kind of idea, and I think it's an idea that comes. I've certainly heard it at the Blueprint before, about people leaning in, people wanting to contribute. When I say people, I mean stakeholders. They could be employees, but they could also be partners, investors, and other stakeholders. Is giving them a reason to want to lean in. I think a lot about the principles, the 5 principles of a purpose-driven company, which is one of the Blueprint frameworks in this, is giving people a reason to want to lean in, to want to contribute of their own discretionary effort to the success of the company because of the connection to the purpose. So I think these are some of the elements. There may be others too that are present when purpose is really central to the organization. I say this particularly in the context of SMEs. It may be true for other companies too, but I'm really framing it in my mind, at least around SMEs. The second is leadership. And so I could further break that down and say, I'm going to talk a bit more about this in a moment, but I think it's paramount that leaders are operating from a place of balance within themselves, as opposed to from a place of high tension and stress and anxiety and worry and fear. So I think there's a certain self-dimension of leadership, which is about being able to operate from a place of balance and clarity. Again, I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. I mentioned scalable leadership because, especially within the SME world, there comes a point within an organization where it reaches a kind of a tipping point, and the founder who's in all of the different areas of the business, in sales in one moment, in business development in the other, in product, in all areas of the business, at some point that's very useful, and that flexibility and that adaptability is great. But in another moment, it becomes a hindrance to the business. And so leaders need to learn to start to go to transition from being the one who achieves the results themselves to equipping and elevating other people to be able to deliver and achieve results. And I think that's where the scalability comes in. And I think that there's the biggest X factor in organizations is really human potential. And so part of the role of the leader, at least in our vision of it, is to be able to help other people to step into more of their potential. And I think some people in the comments at the start mentioned that as well. And then thirdly, around execution, I think there needs to be short-term focus. So, many times I go into a leadership team, I'll ask 6 leaders sitting around the table, I'll say, okay, what is the most important strategic priority for your business in the next 6 months? And you'll get 6 different answers from 6 different people. And this is obviously a problem. This is an indicator of a lack of organizational health. So clarity and alignment around obviously the purpose, the vision, but also, what is our most important strategic priority in the near term? What are the things that we're going to say no to? How do we measure success in the short term? So basic questions around short-term clarity. Effective meetings, which we talked a little bit about earlier on. Obviously, you could say a lot more about that. but effective meetings and teams that are cohesive, that are cross-functional, that are agile, and that are well and that are high performing. And so those are some of the hallmarks, I believe, of a healthy organization. Is that resonating with you all? Is that making sense? Do you have any questions, any comments, or should I keep ticking? Okay, I'll keep ticking. So over these last roughly 10 years and advising probably 200 plus founders, and with huge amounts of help from Lachlan and from Julia, who I'll mention in a moment, it developed a method. The method is called High Impact Culture. It's basically designed to create more joyful, more purposeful, and more high performance, profitable organizations, focusing on organizational health. And the three pillars of that, you'll guess, are those same pillars of purpose, leadership, and execution. All of our work centers around those three areas. And so that brings me on to the next part of what I wanted to share with you, which is thinking about, okay, if we want to cultivate a more healthy organization, how might we go about it? What are the stages of building a more healthy company? And what I've come to realize is that it really does begin with leaders and with founders. There are many cultural signals that are being sent to the rest of the organization about what's important based on conscious and unconscious patterns of thinking and operating that are embodied by leaders and founders. And I really have seen firsthand how the way that leaders operate is really very formative and conditions the way that the organization operates. And so the first kind of, I guess, stage of cultivating organizational health is really around leaders. And I'm going to speak from personal experience of being a founder myself, but also in reference to the many founders that I've been working with over the last years. And what I've observed, and again, I speak for myself here too, is that many of us are operating on some sort of spectrum of mental imbalance. And on the very extreme end of that spectrum, you have burnout, depression, anxiety, panic attacks, and founders, complaining of not being able to sleep, not just founders, leaders, and that very extreme end of the spectrum. And I wonder if what your experiences again have been, but I think this is not as uncommon as we might think, and that it's actually quite prevalent in the workplace. So if we were to work backwards from that extreme picture of depression, burnout, and anxiety, and if we were a group of researchers looking at a team and trying to pinpoint what are some of the early warning signs that you might see in leaders and teams that might be indicative of future burnout, depression, and anxiety, I think what you might observe are things like a loss of energy, difficulties sleeping, struggles switching off mentally, feeling of overwhelm. And before that, you might see symptoms such as mild and frequent stress, the feeling of loneliness, of anxiety, of frustration. And what I want to say is that while these things may be normalized and common, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily normal. And this has been a painful, or no, let me not say a painful, this has been a challenging journey for myself as a founder to come to this realization about my way of operating. Before I talk about that, I was going to share a little bit about my own personal experience around that. But before I talk about that, I wanted to share this quote with you, which was quite striking. The quote is based on this survey, Team Blind survey, and it's supposedly about the pinnacle of the the entrepreneurial ecosystem, Silicon Valley. And what they say is that 68% of tech workers in the big tech companies reported experiencing some form of anxiety or depression, which is a rate far higher than in other sectors. I found that really striking. 68%. That's more than 2/3 of people experiencing anxiety or even depression. And it's certainly become so normalized, and it's almost got to a point, it certainly was for me, that I started to believe that in order to operate in a high performance way, I needed to be a little bit stressed, that stress was a necessary precondition for high performance. And well, I guess I've arrived at a different realization or a different conclusion. Has anyone here ever worked with or met Julia Rebholz? Does anyone know who she is? Yeah, so a few people are putting their thumbs up. So Julia was at the Blueprint for some time. She then left and went to work with another organization called Insight Principles. And along with Lachlan, she was a mentor of mine and somebody who had a very profound impact on my life as an individual, but also professionally. And what I learned through my work with Julia is that stress and anxiety are my own creation. And that my capacity to return to balance is ever present. That there is no moment in my life in which I do not have the capacity to return back to a balanced place, regardless of what's going on around me. And by working with Julia and the Insight Principles framework, I came to realize that that operating from a place of ease and joy and clarity is not been part of my education. I've been taught to work hard, to squeeze my brain, to strive and to squeeze in order to produce results. And actually, there's plenty of scientific research to show that that when our mind is at ease and when we're in a pleasant state of experience, that our mind and our bodies operate at a much higher level of performance. But that's not been part of my education. And so it's been a gradual learning journey to unlearn many of these habitual patterns of thought, which maybe some of us might still have and believe to be true. And really, I challenge you to really, if you do hold any of those beliefs, to question them, to test them, and to see if that's really, really true for yourself. Think of times when you've been in the most pleasant state of experience, and how has that translated to your ability to have clear thought, to have insight, to have influence, and contrast that to times when you've been under tension, under stress, and see how that impacted your abilities. And what I've realized for myself is that I'm far more effective, and it's far more enjoyable when I'm in a more balanced place within myself. And that doesn't mean that I'm always joyful, always have clarity, or any of those things. It just means that I understand where the keys are, and I've learned how to cultivate balance for myself. And as a result of that experience and that journey, we developed a program which is called Slowing Down to Speed Up. And that program is a program that we run for leaders and founders. And it's been really quite transformational in terms of helping leaders to operate from a greater place of ease within themselves, of clarity within themselves, of balance within themselves, which then leads to a lot of the qualities that they're looking for around influence and impact within their organizations. So I guess the takeaway here is if we want to cultivate organizational health and we want to make that cultural, then the first place to look is with the founders and the leaders themselves, and to realize that there are methods and there is support in order to help leaders to cultivate that balance. So that's the first stage. Again, I'm going to just pause there for a moment. If you have any questions, any reflections, any remarks you wanted to make, just wanted to give space for that in case there's anything that people would like to share at all on that topic. Okay. Shall I keep ticking? Okay, cool. Well, you'll be relieved to hear I won't be speaking for too much longer. I just wanted to frame it. Then we can have a breakout and share experiences. So if stage one is about the founders, then I think stage two is all about the team. Now, one of the metrics that we measure as an indicator of our success within organizations is it's not the only metric, but one of the metrics is revenue per employee. And what I've seen to be the case is that within an organization, you could have an employee, a team member, contributing £50,000 or euros to the bottom line, or £300,000 to the bottom line. Both of those are possible. And so that then begs the question, what are the levers of producing a more joyful and high-performing organization? And so again, just to relate this back to SMEs and kind of growing companies, what I've seen is that there are very kind of typical growing pains that come as companies scale. And in the early stages of growth, what's often the case is there's a lot of motivation and clarity around the mission of the organization. There's a certain buzz and energy about being part of a company that's growing, that's accelerating. People have a sense of the connection between the efforts that they make and the impact that they generate. The teams are small, people know each other, trust tends to be built very naturally without having to work very hard at it. There is that environment of psychological safety that often occurs organically. There's a sense of camaraderie and many other kind of ingredients are present that makes for a generally productive and energetic, let's say, organizational environment. And then I've also seen that around about 15 to 20 to 25 or 30 employees, there tends to be a little bit of a tipping point where friction starts to rise, and there tends to be more complexity. Just the number of voices, the separation between people, the remote work, the fact that people are not connected in the same way as they might have been otherwise. More distance starts to creep into the organization. The clarity of what we're working on, what success looks like, both in my role and overall in terms of the strategy. Often what you see within organizations is that they're trying to pursue many, many goals of transformation at the same time. There's not really clear deprioritization. So, the classic, I think it's Patrick Lencioni who said, if everything is important, then nothing is important. So a lot of that starts to creep into the organization where everything suddenly becomes important. People are running around doing lots of different things. Certain chaos arises. And gradually, as the number of people grows, the complexity within the organization increases exponentially. It doesn't increase linear fashion. It increases in an exponential fashion. And more dysfunction tends to creep into the organization. That has the effect of lowering morale, lowering productivity, and then you might start to see things like silos. Teams just focusing on their own outputs and their own KPIs, not really worrying too much about the interdependency between other areas. You might start to see a lot of bottlenecks around decision making. You might see more chaos, more overwhelm. Erosion of culture and kind of pockets of culture arising around charismatic leaders or different teams, more competition arising in the organization, and other kind of classic growing pains that you might see as a company goes from 50 to 150 people. And then by the time you get to 100 or 150 people, you just generally tend to see that the productivity or the revenue per employee goes down. The rate of burnout and overwhelm tends to increase, and generally also fundraising can become more difficult, more challenging. KPIs start to drop, and the overall vision and purpose of the company is put into more jeopardy. So you know, I think those are symptoms that you may have observed in the organizations that you've worked, and they can obviously erode both well-being, performance, and scalability of the organization. So I just thought I'd share with you a little bit about a case study of a company where I've been working, and then we'll jump into, I'd love to hear much more from you all about your experiences on these topics. So I'm sharing with you a story, if you like, about a company called Bridge for Billions. Now, Bridge for Billions are an Ashoka company. For those of you that are familiar with the Ashoka network, the founder is a Ashoka Fellow. It's a social enterprise, meaning that they exist explicitly to solve a social issue. And the reason I picked Bridge for Billions is because, you know, the purpose part is already very much baked into the fabric of the organization. They're born out of a clear social cause, which is about inequality and lack of access to entrepreneurship for people of different origins, races, ethnicities, gender inequalities, and so on. So they exist to kind of level the playing field around access to entrepreneurship, because they believe in entrepreneurship as a vehicle for social and economic upliftment. So that's really what Bridge is about. And so the purpose was already very present within the organization, which is interesting because a lot of times, you know, purpose is lacking within an organization. I purposely chose this company because it was already very present, very baked into the fabric. And this was a company that was talking about teal, about self-management, about self-organization, and had two founders, co-founders, that for all intents and purposes were very kind of enlightened people who had very, let's say, noble and kind of good intentions around how the business ought to be run. Yet the reality on the ground was quite dysfunctional. I'm going back about 4 years when I first began working with them. And I remember this particular occasion. In fact, Julia was there. She had accompanied me on an annual retreat that Bridge for Billions ran every single year. So they would gather their teams. By the way, their teams are spread out in Latin America, in the US, around Europe. So people from all around the world, 4 full days gathered together for an offsite, for a retreat in August or in July. And Julia was there with me. And for those of you that are familiar, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the spectrum of leadership that Blueprint have come up with. It's forget the name of it, but it's around collective venture. So on one side you have command and control, in the middle you have command and collective, and on the right hand side you have collective venture. I don't know if you've seen that spectrum. Sulu, what's that diagram called?
Yeah, it's called command and control versus collective venture, and we'll be sharing something, an adaptation of that at the next workshop, where we talk about thinking of business as a machine versus thinking of business as a human organization and the difference between the two. So it's a kind of, we've involved that a little bit, but yeah.
So I think it's something to do with archetypes or paradigms or something like that. And so basically we were using that framing, and I remember we had the team, so we made a spectrum, right? There's 60 people it was about 50 people at the time in the organization, and we created a physical spectrum where on one side we're on a lawn, and on one side of the lawn we described command and control, and on the other end of the spectrum we described collective venture. And we asked people to line themselves up along the spectrum in terms of where they thought the organization was at that moment. And bear in mind, this was a company that, you know, like I said, it's already purpose-focused, purpose-driven. You know, they were very much orientated towards teal and self-organization. The leaders had read Reinventing Organizations and were tending towards that model of building the organization. Yet the reality on the ground was that about 80% of the team, barring a few people in the leadership team, were very far left of the center point. And it was a very visual and stark picture of like, wow, like we have these ideals and these intentions of who we want to be and who we intend to be, but the reality on the ground is very different. And there were people genuinely suffering. And when we asked people as to why they'd chosen to stand where they stood, they talked about dysfunctional relationships with their leaders, meetings that were unenergizing, doing work that was disconnected from the purpose, and all of these signs of organizational ill health. And so we embarked on this project. It was 4 years ago with Bridge, and I'm very, kind of grateful and pleased to say that Bridge is in a completely different place at the moment. And they've now grown as a team. They've scaled up. They have operations all around the world. Pablo, the founder, was literally on the verge of a burnout. He was constantly biting his nails. He was always worried and fearful. His communication was always, my fears are these, my fears are these, my worries are these. So he was spreading fear in the organization. He was finding it hard to sleep. He wasn't switching off on the weekends. And all of the telltale signs of an overworked and overwhelmed leader. And he went through the Slowing Down to Speed Up program. He had profound realizations about himself, about his ability to cultivate his own balance. And he returned after a 2-day offsite, really a different individual. And it was beautiful because people in his network, well, his leadership team started to ask him and said, what's happened to you? What's different? What's changed for you? And then he was able to share a little bit about his own journey and invited other people, by sharing his journey, invited other people to connect and ask themselves questions as well. And then we ran a series of programs around scalable leadership, around connecting to purpose. We developed OKRs programs, different programs at Bridge to really address some of the symptoms that we were seeing around organizational health. And I'm not saying today that it's a perfect organization, far from it. They still have plenty of challenges, but it's an organization that's growing in a balanced way. The founders have their feet very much on the ground. They are optimizing themselves for well-being, which is quite a profound statement to make. That means that if they find themselves getting caught in cycles of anxiety and worry, they actually take time to pause, to stop, to recultivate that balance, and then to operate from that place of greater clarity. And it's showing. They've been able to 5x their impact in terms of the number of entrepreneurs that they've supported globally. They've 3x their revenues. And overall, the well-being indicators in the organization are also moving in the right direction. So I wanted to share that experience with you, just to kind of frame it a bit. And then I thought we could, one last quote, actually, sorry. This was interesting. So an organizational health index, which McKinsey have been doing, they have a practice in organizational health. They've been doing this for 20 years. And they found that companies that improve their organizational health are overall 18% greater in EBITDA than after 1 year compared to companies that don't focus on that, which I thought was a very clear, intangible, measurable outcome. Because a lot of times the argument against organizational health is that it's hard to quantify and hard to measure. And I think that it's not so hard to quantify. It's just that the lag time between intervention and result is a lot longer compared to if you just, let's say, hire a strategy consultant or bring in a head of sales who's going to generate revenue in the first 3 months. Does that make sense? It's not that it's not measurable, and it's not that it's not impactful. It clearly is impactful. That's been our experience and the experience of McKinsey and others. But the issue is that we have a bias towards quantification in the short term. And a lot of times interventions require a maturity period before they start to yield results. And it can be harder to see the cause and effect relationship, which then makes leaders tend towards organizational intelligence and focusing there, instead of operating and focusing on organizational health, which is where I believe the real competitive advantage lies for organizations. So with that said, I wanted to offer you guys an opportunity to go into breakouts, maybe 4 or 5 people. How are we doing on time, actually? 5:45. Yeah, so I think we have a solid at least 10 minutes for the breakouts. And the 2 questions that I wanted to put on the table are, how does this framing that I've shared with you around purpose, leadership, and execution, how does this framing correlate with your own experiences? What have you observed around organizations that are either healthy or dysfunctional? What have been your experiences around either leading teams, organizations, or working for and with teams and organizations that are either healthy or unhealthy? What have you seen about that? And then second of all, what kind of interventions have you either tried and experimented with yourself or witnessed and experienced, either as a recipient or as somebody doing them, that have either been effective or ineffective? And I'm just really curious to know, what have you seen and learned around this topic, which I believe is really fundamental to organizational success. Are the questions clear? Did you have any questions about that before we jump into the breakouts? Any questions on the question?
No, thank you.
Okay, cool. So I think James is going to set you up in breakouts. You'll have 10 minutes. I think we'll probably give you a prompt when you have about a minute left, just to let you know, just to wrap up. You'll have 10 minutes. Just discuss in small groups of up to 5 people. What's your experience of how this has been framed? What have you seen around organizational health? And what kind of interventions do you think have been effective or ineffective? Over to all of you. And then we'll come back and it would be great if you wanted to share some of the highlights from your discussion with the rest of the group. Thank you so much. Well, welcome back, and thanks for taking part in those breakouts. I'm really genuinely so curious to hear what have been your experiences around organizational health, and what kind of interventions have you seen, either effective or ineffective? Would anyone like to share what they discussed in their groups, or any insights you had? Nick, I believe, has his hand up.
Hi there. Yeah, thank you. I think we had a very good conversation. I'm not sure we specifically answered it to sort of that detail. We started going into a really lovely sort of space. The thing that I think we decided was around, it depends on which lens and which perspective you look at around what do you consider to be organizational health. So if we think about the systems that we're all part of, if you have a perspective of trying to deliver on shorter term metrics and measures, you might have a different view of what organizational health looks like. Whereas if you're looking at a longer term, you might consider more of a broader stakeholder kind of view, and that would mean that you'd have different metrics. We then explored potentially what metrics we might use, and then it goes into the bigger system of financial measures, which obviously is a lot of the measures that you might have, and your integrity might then be squeezed down into how much energy do you put into this, because you might want to put a return onto it. And then I just we also explored that idea of, as your business grows or as your organization grows, the culture may be one way, but as you start to get to a point where you get either acquired or merge or something, then you've then got an idea of what do those things mean to different sort of parts of that system, and then that's the bit that then you've got to sort of try and hold on to or maintain.
Yeah.
I wonder if, with picking up on what you're saying there, in terms of framework, clear thumbs up. There was consensus in the cohort I was a part of. Absolutely stacks the cards in the favor of organizational health. The piece that did arise early in our discussion was, what about what's happening outside of the organization, and the outside in, the implication to organizational health. So all of those points, purpose, the aspects around leadership, execution, that sets the foundation, stacks the cards in the favor. But we can't sort of forget or ignore what is outside the organization and the implication to organizational health. I don't know if that lands with you, Nash, or lands with others.
It certainly makes me think of the race car analogy, because the car has to operate. There's a certain environmental condition, right? There's a track temperature, there's the air temperature, there's the market basically, and what's going on around. And then there's the vehicle of the business, and then there's how well that vehicle is being driven. Now, of course, the environment is very much influential. But the question for me that comes to my mind as you're speaking is, do we consider that the outside environment is influential, and it basically has influence, it has a bearing, or do we consider it to be deterministic in terms of what happens to organizational health? In other words, does the outside create the inside, or does the outside create a set of conditions, and then it's still up to us how we create the inside? Does that make sense? That's the question that is arising for me as I'm speaking.
Yeah, in response to that, I would say that I would broaden it out and say that they are absolutely interdependent. And we can't just think about the growth of the organization or the impact that we are having or the impact that geopolitical or economic forces have on the business. I think we have to be thinking much bigger, frankly, and they're absolutely interdependent. And yeah, I don't know what else to say to that, really. So I don't think it's either or. I don't know, does that make sense? Does that? Yeah.
Does to me. What else came up in your conversations about what you observed about organizational health and what's working and not working in that space? I think Brooke has her hand up.
Yes. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm in United States, and Sola knows, like, I've been following Europe. I have a lot of good, wonderful global community. So I can only say it from my perspective, but also what we discussed in the breakout room. Thank you, Nina, for summarizing it. But it feels like, at least from my point of view and my experience for 2 decades now, unless the leaders are conscious, like what you have also discussed during the presentation, they're conscious enough to find out what they're lacking, what kind of a leader they want to be. It's not about their identity or their ego, but they're there for the right reasons. I have never seen any healthy company, and if I've seen it with the founders or the visionaries, and got to grow just like you have explained, then they lose it, because in this world and the systems that we created, we measure always the wrong things. And even when purpose came out, like just starting to find ways of measuring purpose, I mean, it drives me crazy, but this is the world we live in. But we always seem to make wrong things because of the financial system, because we have these brains that is always linear. So that's why, I mean, I don't want to be a downer here, but it seems like it is such a hard uphill battle to fight for, and it is doable, but when it gets to the growth stage, like you explained, it becomes so much more difficult, because everybody has to show the numbers, and people still don't see the tie between the purpose and the social enterprise and the impact, the positive impact on this world, like we see in this group. Obviously, I don't need to speak to you guys, but in the big picture, in the 2 decades that I've been in this business, it's been so hard. And I don't know. That's why I feel like it comes back to the consciousness level of every one of us. As it gets better, then it's going to get better. And I'm a big believer in teal organizations too, but I was in a meeting with them just last week. We were still saying how to do this still. That's what I wanted to share. Perspective on this. I feel like you are and Europe are ahead of us. That's how I feel too.
Thank you for sharing that very useful perspective, Brooke. Appreciate that. What else occurs to you around organizational health? What you've seen, what you've experienced?
No takers. Come on.
Well, I've kind of put my hand up, but I'm really going to just echo what Brooke is saying, and I'm in the UK where there's a lot of social purpose organisations, obviously massive movements around B Corp and all these things. But what I'm seeing in the SMEs that I work with is just this lack of understanding about where things are going wrong. The leaders are so focused on, perhaps they're so involved in their own minds and trying to push the business forward and kind of make money, that they don't take time to slow down and kind of stop. And often small businesses are built on people's passions. They're not built by people with leadership skills or with business skills. They're just kind of passionate, dynamic, driven people. And often when I'm talking to them, a large amount of them seem to have really low confidence, which is quite strange, and imposter syndrome. So I think, it's wonderful having these conversations, but in order to make the change happen, it needs a massive shift in small businesses' understanding of what is a healthy business. And I think that's down to kind of business programs, but the business programs I work on don't deal with organisational health. They touch on leadership, but it's all linked to financial performance. So that concerns me, and many of them still don't address sustainability in any meaningful way.
Yeah, there's a lot of work for us. I think some people have their hands up.
Yeah, I think Nick, you were next. Yeah.
Apologies, I feel like I'm hogging the talking, but yeah, I feel very passionately about this. I think following what Brooke said, I think it does feel as though that level of consciousness, which I think is what I'm feeling and seeing in the work that I'm doing, is around this perspective of the disconnection that has occurred more deeply within ourselves. So that kind of idea that we are so fragmented from our own intuition and our own inner wisdom. Then you've then got the bigger systems of what does that then mean about our connection with the outside world, the environment and things. And then what does that then mean about the organisations that we're part of, around how do we then make a living in that kind of sense. So that's the bit that I feel is so interesting, is that I believe there is it feels as though, and again, you're in these kind of bubbles, aren't you, in your sort of life, but it feels like there is this sort of awakening of something where people are beginning to question and say, is this it? Like, we've literally done all the right things. We believe we've done what was asked of us. We've earned all this money. We paid our taxes, and yet we're in the middle of a meta crisis that was not our doing. Our leaders or our kind of people have created some kind of collective movement that has caused this to happen. And I believe people are beginning to wake up to that. And there are some amazing, movements of things. There are people looking at, sort of more what you consider the woo-woo type spiritual end of stuff. But I think people are beginning to wake up that is actually quite deep knowledge as well. And also around the idea of like being a person with agency as individual as well. So that, I think, comes through into the way that organisations are seeing. And I think there is an issue where an organisation will ask you to come to work as your whole self, but they may not like that, because you might come to work and ask questions that they don't like the answer to, which is around just making them lots of money, which ultimately is where reward is often put in these larger organisations, despite saying they want more balance. So yeah, I'm trying to embrace the inner hippie, and I'm just trying to sort of say that fundamentally this is the way businesses operated up until the 70s and 80s. You literally ran your business with a purpose, and once it achieved it, you might close that business. Whereas now we don't do that. We run it, say it's a purpose. Even Patagonia's obviously, it's been through, and I love the book, Let People Go Surfing as well. It's big in my own life, but you look at it and you think, Yvonne Chouinard had the same challenge. He was like, what do I do? It's got so big. Now what do I do with it? So that's where I'm kind of at with it. It's kind of inner wisdom and just compassion and love, which I think hopefully just saves the day.
Yeah, Nick, 100%. You touched on many things there. I think there's other people with their hands up, so I don't want to hog the microphone. David?
Thank you, Nash. Really just picking up on your point about the environmental piece, and I think we are seeing a gap between what organisations value and what society values, and I think that's becoming a little unhealthy. There's something about the way that organisations act in individual interest, which makes perfect sense, but they have a collective impact, and it's not always healthy for us. So we're looking at loneliness as an epidemic within many countries, which has been exacerbated by the fact that we're digitising everything and actually removing the opportunities for people to connect, even briefly. For some people, it may just be one conversation in the supermarket. And I think there are areas where we really need to question what we value as a goal and whether it's actually a false goal in terms of the longer term well-being. So is convenience really what we want in everything, because it's removing perhaps opportunities for exercise, which then has an epidemic around some of the aspects of health and well-being. We're seeing that with mental well-being and the aspects of trust. So I think there feels like there's a growing disconnect between what organisations individually seek and that unintended, perhaps, collective impact on society. And that's a flowing thing that impacts each other. So the way organisations impact people then obviously has a return aspect in terms, because they're their customers, their employees, their stakeholders. And I think that's something we need to really think about a little bit more. How do we understand that collective impact and direction in shaping society when you have organisations acting in their own interests? Does that make sense?
Certainly does. There's so many really interesting and deep points being brought up. I feel like we could easily have a much longer conversation about this. I know Stuart had your hand up as well, so I wanted to make sure you.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief, as it were. But I think the questions that Dave asked there and the speaker before him, sorry, I forgot your name. I apologise.
Nick, I think it was.
Yeah, it's about our society and whether our society is the one that we want. And I think, unfortunately, there's a huge disconnection between what many of us want, and especially on this call, we've probably got common views on the subject matter. But the environment was not even on the ticket of either of the political parties in the last general election. So that says to me that whilst we might be enlightened on this topic and recognise that the planet's going to outlive us is definitely a matter of fact, but it would help if we would do something about it remaining habitable, in my view. And that doesn't seem to be on people's agenda as a whole. The majority of our society are far more interested in money. And so it feels like it's something we're going to have to, it's got to be, there has to be some leadership at a national, political, global level. And there's an absence of leadership, it seems to me. And the press, I think, are very unhelpful in all of this as well, of course. So sorry, I haven't got any solutions whatsoever in regard to that, but it is systemic, the problems.
Well, I certainly don't, pretend to have answers to these very important and profound questions that you are putting on the table. What I would say is a couple of things have come to my mind as you've been speaking. Number one is there is a very sound case for organizational health and its relationship to organizational performance. What's interesting is I think I don't know if I'm right in saying this, there are probably people better placed to know than I am, but I think we're approaching a moment in the economic cycle where there's certainly a lot of uncertainty and talk of recession. At least over here in Spain, I don't know what it's like in the UK. And I think that this kind of more recessionary times when money is tight can all actually provide a useful impetus for a focus inwards within the organization. When money is free and when money is cheap, then people tend to go for the easy option. Now I think we're at a point where people might be looking to optimize their own organizations in order to excel and to succeed. And the reason I shared the quote of McKinsey is because they've done empirical study, given their size and about the relationship between interventions in organizational health and its impact to profitability, which is very interesting because a lot of people would argue that these kind of interventions are nice to have, but are not necessary. Actually, it's not the case. The graveyard is full of companies that are intelligent but lacked organizational health. They didn't make the right decisions. They weren't able to pivot their strategy according to the changes in the market. Like I think Helen was talking about the interdependency between the outside world and the inside world. Of course, there's a huge interdependency. As leaders, you need to be able to pivot and understand what's going on. How do we evolve? How do we hire? How do we change our strategy? What's the product evolution, etc. So there's that aspect to it. And then there's this kind of more deeply human dimension to it about I think somebody mentioned about people who have been successful in the outside world. Maybe they've had successful careers, they've earned money, they've paid their taxes, they've done well, and yet they're unhappy, yet they're unfulfilled. And that starts to raise questions and doubts in people's minds as to, like, what are we doing? If you can have all of these trappings of success on the outside, but you're still unhappy and unfulfilled, then what's going on here? And that's where the role of consciousness in business really has a much greater role to play, because at least I'm going to speak in the first person here. What I've realized to be true for myself is that, the human mind has a certain design to it, like anything does. The laptops that you're staring at have a certain design to it. The mouse that has a certain design to it. The heart has a certain design to it. The human body has a certain design to it. And the mind has a design to it. Now, the difference with the mind compared to any other organ in the body is that the design of the mind is not visible. You can see, if you dissect a human heart, you can see how it works. You can see how the blood goes in, what it does, how it pumps, and you can understand it through the physical sciences. Whereas with the mind, you can't see how experience is being created. It's not visible. You can't dissect a brain and say, oh, I see, it comes in here and it goes out over there. Does that make sense? It's invisible. And what I've been kind of realizing is that it's substituting thinking for attention. It's the power of cultivating human attention. Just paying attention to how things are, not how I want them to be, not how I believe they think not how I believe they ought to be, not how I wish them to be, but it's just actually paying attention to what is there in the real world in this moment. And the practice of learning to cultivate attention over thinking, not to say thinking doesn't have a role, but to realize that there is another dimension of experience which is not intellectual, which is just experiential. It is just about quietening the mind. That's why it's called slowing down to speed up. It's because what we're trying to get founders to do, and do myself very, very much, very often, is to develop practices and habits that allow me to slow down mentally, because I'm just carried away in a world of ideas and opinions and beliefs, and then just grounding myself into the present moment. And then from that place of greater groundedness, looking for insight and wisdom as to how to act in a given moment. And that's not, I'm not saying that that's easy or something that can just be switched on like that. But I think that there is an increasing number of leaders who are suffering and struggling, and who this message has been resonating very strongly with. At least that's been my experience. And what I've observed among those leaders is that when they do get to a more grounded place within themselves, they show up differently. They act differently. They act from a different place. They listen differently. They influence differently. And I feel like this is the missing piece, or a missing piece in how we approach it. We have all of these processes, techniques, strategies, but we're often operating from a place of mental noise. It's like, I imagine you had a computer screen above your head, and the computer screen could show to the outside world all of the millions of thoughts that were going around in my mind at any given moment. It would just look completely insane. If it was visible to any other person what was going on inside my mind at any given moment, you'd just think I'm insane. And I think that would probably be true for most of humanity. And so the idea of slowing down is not about doing less. It's just about learning to slow down from the mental noise. It's about learning to create a little bit of distance between you and all of the busyness of the mind. And from that place of greater stillness, I believe that we can have much more healthy, much more high-performing organizations, which does actually translate into performance, productivity, and eventually into financial results. At least that's been our experience.
I just want to add, from a Blueprint's work perspective, what we're observing from some of the larger companies is that providing space for people, for senior leaders, to actually have time to see differently and to think in a way that is different to just having an action list and just getting on with it, does free them up to see a different problem, a different issue, and give them a different way of approaching it. And yes, there's lots of stuff out there that gets in the way, and yes, the system is not what we want it to be, but that's what we've got at the moment. I mean, if we wait to try and create a different system, we're not going to save the planet or change anything. We need to work with what we've got in the meantime and hope that a different system will also emerge. So there's a kind of like, we need to work with what we've got and hope that also there's other people, or that part of what we're doing is creating something new. But just accepting that we've got what we've got and then working with that. I mean, you know, that's all we can do, isn't it? And providing spaces where people can connect to a different way of thinking and feeling and seeing, and a mindset shift. Well, that's the way that Blueprint does it. And we do see, like, we're working in a community of practice at the moment where we get practitioners that are doing this work inside organizations, and they are exhausted and they are tired and they are frustrated. Some of them end up leaving. And what we're trying to do is create a space for them to have the courage and the capacity and the to stay and find from each other the courage to keep going and sharing what works, what doesn't work, and you know, and it is helping. I mean, obviously, lots of other things could help too. But I just wanted to share that. So yeah, and for you guys too, because the work is hard, isn't it? It's not. I mean, I've been at Blueprint for 12 years, and sometimes I'm like, what am I doing? Nothing is changing. But things are shifting slowly, aren't they? They are. It's just too slow. But we can't give up. We need to keep going. And I think this kind of sharing helps us to do that, I hope. Anyway, I just want to thank Nash. We've got 5 minutes left. Has anyone got any more burning questions for Nash? Because also we want to just kind of wrap up. And Nash, you wanted to share right at the beginning. You shared there's a survey that you were doing. I'm going to put it in the link and I'm going to send it round. Do you want to just talk a little bit about what this survey is, Nash, so we can ask people?
Well, in essence, one of the things that we did to help, somebody had said, I think it might have been Claire, said that organizations or leaders are just not aware of where to look. And so what we did, I saw the same thing, when you were saying that, I was just kind of nodding with it myself. So what we did in response to that is we created an organizational health audit. It's basically an opportunity for leaders to assess their health, to look at their strengths and their weaknesses, and then we debrief that audit for teams, leadership teams, and we help them to see a number of things. But one of the main things we help them to see is how cultivating health in these different areas of purpose, leadership, and execution can benefit their business. And we help them to have their own insight and realization about how working on these things is going to translate into the outcomes that they themselves are asking for. And that's been a really successful thing. We haven't had enough opportunity to do that. We'd love to do more of it. But one of the things that I'm doing at the moment is we've created a mini version of the audit. And from that mini version, I'm trying to get at least 100 responses to it. So if you're running an SME, if you're a leader within a company, if you know people who are running companies, if you can have anyone answer the audit, what we're going to do is we're going to build an organizational health barometer on the back of it. The barometer is just going to basically share some industry trends and insights about what's prevalent in the market around organizational health, and then some quick win strategies that companies can start to develop to see quick wins and get energy, get traction under the belt, to then invest in more of a program around organizational health. So my ask to you is, Sula's kindly going to share the link with you.
It's in the chat.
Yeah, it's in the chat. Maybe we'll share it on the email as well.
Yeah.
If you can fill it in yourself, or the leaders within the organizations where you work can fill it in. Whoever responds to it will then collate that, produce a report, and send it to those people who have responded. And then hopefully that will begin more of a conversation around organizational health and how we can cultivate it.
So I just wanted to end by a big thank you to Nash for running this session and sharing his experiences, and thank you very much. And then finally, a little plug for I've sent you all an invitation to one of our coaches and consultants meetings, which is going to run in person and online on the 18th and the 19th of November. And the topic, actually quite a nice segue from what we've been discussing today. It's to sort of share some insights that we've got from practitioners that have been thinking about culture and how you create a culture in an organization that supports a purpose-led business. So I will send around as the pre-read the thinking that came out of that group, but it's really to help you to have space to talk about how do you create, and so it's building on what we're discussing about, how do you create a culture that links to, how does an organization build a culture that supports it to be purpose-led? So please come and join us for that. Let me know if you haven't already, you want to join, and I will send around a pre-read which includes the outputs that came from that purpose and practice community for you to have a look at and see what people in large corporates thought about this topic. And I think we've ended 1 minute early, so thank you all very, very much. Again, thanks to Nash, and yeah, see you all soon, hopefully.
Thank you all again. I really appreciate
you,
it. Your
Stella.
questions, your energy.
Thanks.